The most powerful man in the world, Donald Trump, sitting in his office, completely convinced he's about to reshape global politics forever. His target, India. And he thought he had it all figured out. Flash some defense deals, wave some trade agreements around, throw in some praise about democracy, and boom, India would become America's most reliable partner in Asia. What happened next would send shockwaves through every capital city from Washington to Moscow to Beijing. You see, Trump wasn't just thinking about China as his biggest problem. India was the prize he really wanted. Over 1 billion people, fastest growing major economy, and what looked like a desperate hunger for American approval. His strategy was pure old-school diplomacy, the kind that worked when America could dictate terms to any country that needed superpower backing. But Trump made one critical mistake. He thought he was dealing with the same India that had spent decades walking on eggshells around the world's major powers, the same country that used to carefully balance between superpowers, always trying not to upset anyone important. What he encountered instead was something entirely different, a nation that had quietly transformed while nobody was paying attention. Enter Dr. S. Jaishankar, not your typical diplomat who speaks in endless circles and never gives you a straight answer. This man had something that made seasoned negotiators nervous. He was calm, calculated, and completely unimpressed by theatrics and pressure tactics. When Trump's administration started turning up the heat, expecting the usual scrambling and desperate negotiations, Jaishankar did something that caught everyone off guard. He listened, he processed everything carefully, and then he responded with surgical precision. The pressure campaign started exactly like you'd expect. Trump's team began making moves designed to force India's hand. They stripped India of its GSP benefits, those special trade privileges that developing nations treasure like gold. They threatened massive tariff increases. They tried to muscle India out of its oil relationships with Iran, waving sanctions around like they were doing India some huge favor by offering temporary waivers. The Pentagon started making serious noise about India's defense partnerships with Russia, particularly that S-400 missile deal that had Washington strategic planners losing sleep. Every single move was calculated to send the same clear message: fall in line or face the consequences, choose America's vision for the world or get left behind in the dust. It was the exact same playbook that had worked countless times before with other allies who eventually buckled under the pressure and gave America exactly what it wanted. But something strange happened. Instead of the usual desperate phone calls, instead of the frantic diplomatic missions to Washington, instead of the compromises and concessions that everyone expected, there was silence. Not the silence of surrender, but the silence of a chess master studying the board while his opponent celebrates a move that hasn't actually won the game yet. Then came the moment that changed everything. In a press conference that most people barely noticed, Jaishankar was asked about India's response to American pressure tactics. What he said next would be analyzed in think tanks, discussed in intelligence briefings, and quoted in diplomatic circles for years to come. One word. Just one word that carried the weight of 1 billion people's aspirations and the strength of a civilization that had survived for thousands of years. Reciprocity. That's it. 4 syllables that sounded almost mundane to casual observers, but sent tremors through every major government building in the world. Because reciprocity isn't just a vocabulary word from diplomatic textbooks, it's a declaration of independence wrapped in polite language. You want to understand what that word really meant? It meant that the days of one-sided relationships were over. It meant India wasn't going to play the grateful recipient anymore. You raise tariffs on us, we'll raise tariffs on you. You ban our tech companies, we'll ban yours. You try to dictate our foreign policy, we'll remind you that we're a sovereign nation with our own interests to protect. Trump, for all his deal-making experience, wasn't prepared for that response. He had walked into countless negotiations expecting to be the only one setting the terms. But here was India, a country he had labeled as developing and therefore presumably dependent, telling him that the rules had changed completely, not with anger, not with threats, but with a quiet confidence that was somehow more unsettling than any dramatic outburst could have been. The word reciprocity triggered something that Trump's team hadn't anticipated, a complete recalibration of how the world saw India's position. Suddenly, other nations started paying serious attention. If India could stand up to American pressure without collapsing, without begging for mercy, without making desperate concessions, what did that mean for the global balance of power? But Jaishankar wasn't done. When Trump's administration pushed India to completely cut off oil imports from Iran, thinking they could force India to abandon a crucial energy supplier, the response was measured but absolutely firm. India would make decisions based on its national interests, not on pressure from Washington. Period. When Trump floated the idea of mediating on Kashmir, inserting America into India's most sensitive territorial issue, the response was swift and crystal clear. There is no role for third-party mediation. End of discussion. Each response followed the exact same pattern. No drama, no emotional outbursts, no burning of diplomatic bridges, just clear, calm assertions of sovereignty that left zero room for misinterpretation. It was like watching a masterclass in diplomatic Aikido, using the opponent's force against them without ever engaging in direct confrontation. The beauty of Jaishankar's approach was that it exposed the fundamental flaw in Trump's entire strategy. The whole American approach was built on outdated assumptions about India's desperation for approval and acceptance. They assumed India would trade its autonomy for proximity to American power. They assumed India could be leveraged, pressured, and ultimately controlled through a combination of carrots and sticks. But what they encountered was a country that had spent decades building its own center of gravity. India wasn't looking to be aligned with anyone. It was looking to be respected by everyone. The difference is subtle but absolutely crucial. Alignment implies subordination. Respect implies equality. Take the defense sector, for example. Trump loved selling weapons, tanks, planes, missiles, sophisticated defense systems. And yes, India bought some. It was excellent business for American defense contractors and seemed to confirm the transactional nature of the relationship that Trump preferred. But then Jaishankar flipped the script again. India would only purchase what aligned with its long-term strategic needs. And more importantly, India would simultaneously build its own defense capabilities. Suddenly, American defense executives found themselves competing not just with Russian and European suppliers, but with Indian companies that were developing hypersonic missiles, anti-satellite technology, aircraft carriers, and advanced drone systems. The plan to make India a long-term customer for American weapons started crumbling as India made it crystal clear that it wasn't interested in being anyone's customer forever. It intended to become a creator and competitor. This wasn't happening in isolation. While Trump was focused on his pressure campaign, Jaishankar was quietly revolutionizing India's entire approach to international relations. The old model of non-alignment, staying neutral between superpowers, was replaced with something far more sophisticated, multi-alignment. India would engage with everyone on its own terms, building partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than ideological alignment or historical loyalty. So India strengthened ties with Russia while also deepening cooperation with the United States. It expanded partnerships with Iran while building bridges with Israel. It engaged with China on trade while standing absolutely firm on border disputes. To outside observers, it might have looked inconsistent or opportunistic, but there was clear logic to it. India was building a foreign policy that served Indian interests first, without apology or explanation to anyone. The Quad partnership, the strategic dialogue between the US, India, Japan, and Australia, perfectly illustrated this approach. Trump's team saw it as the perfect vehicle for containing China, a way to get India to join America's strategic rivalry with Beijing. But Jaishankar made it clear from the very beginning that India's participation was based on its own vision of the Indo-Pacific, not on joining someone else's containment strategy, even when Chinese troops engaged in aggressive actions along the line of actual control, creating the most serious border crisis in decades. India didn't run to Washington asking for military support or security guarantees. Instead, India handled the situation with its own resources while maintaining diplomatic channels with all parties involved. It was a masterclass in strategic autonomy, being strong enough to handle your own problems while staying engaged with the international community on your own terms. The cumulative effect of all these moves was absolutely stunning. Countries around the world started taking notice of what India was doing and began wondering if they could follow a similar path. Could you engage with multiple powers without becoming anyone's subordinate? Could you build partnerships without compromising your sovereignty? Could you say no to superpowers without facing devastating consequences? The answer, as demonstrated by India's example, was a resounding yes. But it required something that many countries lacked: the confidence to believe in your own worth and the patience to build alternative options instead of depending on a single patron. Trump's frustration was obvious. Here was a country that was supposed to be grateful for American attention, supposed to be eager for American approval, supposed to be willing to make sacrifices for American friendship. Instead, he found himself dealing with a nation that treated America as one important partner among many, not as the center of the universe around which all other countries should orbit. The psychological impact of this shift cannot be overstated. For decades, American foreign policy had been built on the assumption that every country secretly wanted to be closer to the United States, that American approval was the ultimate prize in international relations. Countries might resist American pressure temporarily, but eventually they would see the wisdom of alignment and come around. India shattered that assumption completely, not through confrontation or rebellion, but through the simple act of building its own path and sticking to it regardless of external pressure. It was a quiet revolution that sent ripples throughout the entire international system. Other countries started paying attention to how India maneuvered on the global stage. They saw that independence didn't mean isolation, that being assertive didn't require being aggressive, that rejecting unfair terms wasn't being ungrateful, it was being sovereign. The Indian model became a case study in how middle powers could navigate great power competition without becoming pawns in someone else's game. It proved that there was a third option between being a junior partner to one superpower or another. The transformation wasn't just about foreign policy. It extended to every aspect of how India engaged with the world. In technology, India built its own digital infrastructure instead of simply adopting American or Chinese systems. In space, India developed cost-effective solutions that competed directly with established players. In pharmaceuticals, India became a global supplier instead of just a market for Western companies. Each sector told the same story. India was moving from being a rule taker to being a rule maker, from being a market to being a competitor, from being a junior partner to being an equal stakeholder. And at the diplomatic level, Jaishankar was the architect and spokesperson for this transformation. His approach was revolutionary precisely because it didn't look revolutionary. There were no dramatic speeches, no burning of flags, no inflammatory rhetoric, just a steady, consistent assertion of India's right to make its own choices based on its own interests. It was diplomacy as martial arts, redirecting force rather than meeting it head on, achieving victory through balance rather than through conquest. The long-term implications of this shift are still unfolding. Trump's departure from office didn't change the fundamental dynamic that Jaishankar had established. Subsequent American administrations have had to grapple with the same reality. India is not going to be anyone's junior partner, regardless of who occupies the White House or what incentives are offered. But the impact extends far beyond US-India relations. The Indian example has inspired other countries to think differently about their own foreign policy options. The old binary choices, East versus West, alignment versus non-alignment, dependence versus isolation, have given way to more nuanced approaches that prioritize national interest over ideological conformity. This is perhaps Jaishankar's greatest achievement. He didn't just change India's position in the world. He changed how the world thinks about power, partnership, and sovereignty. He proved that in an interconnected world, the smartest strategy isn't choosing sides. It's building bridges that serve your interests while maintaining the flexibility to adapt as circumstances change. One word, spoken with quiet confidence, can indeed change the world, especially when it's backed by the strength of 1 billion people who've decided they're done asking for permission to be themselves. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. The ripple effects of that single word didn't stop at government buildings or diplomatic meetings. They started showing up in boardrooms, in tech conferences,